Good afternoon and welcome back to the second part of our macro discussions. In the second half, we propose to focus on issues relating to inflation in India. We have two papers to be presented. One is by Dr. Radhika Pandey on performance of inflation targeting regime in India, and the second is by Dr. Rudrani Bhattacharya on measuring the impact of supply chain disruptions on inflation in India. I'd like to welcome Dr. Rakesh Mohan for taking the time and being here. He needs no introduction. He's currently with CSEP, but he's had so many avatars and so many different hats to his.
All the hats fly off.
Yeah, well, it gets replaced by a new one. So you're not hatless at any point. In particular, his experience with macro policy formulation as well as the stint with the Reserve Bank of India draw one's attention in the context of the topic we'd like to discuss today. So thank you very much and welcome to this discussion. We'll hand over the mic to our two speakers to take us through the two talks, and then we'll request you for your comments on the same. Is it not dependent on this one? It's working. It's
working. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about the journey of inflation targeting regime in India. It's an ongoing joint work with Ila Patnaik and Rajeshwari Sen Gupta. Now we have 8 years of experience on inflation targeting. So what has been the monetary policy process during this period? What has been the inflation experience? And what are the, some of the challenges which, if addressed, could further enhance the effectiveness of the inflation targeting regime in India? These are some of the areas that we propose to talk in the paper. So just to set the context, it has been 8 years since India adopted the inflation targeting regime. So this paper presents an analysis of the inflation targeting regime. It evaluates the performance, the process, which includes the interest rate decisions, the stance, the voting patterns of the Monetary Policy Committee members, because now we have data on 2 monetary policy committees, tenure of 2 monetary policy committees, so we can actually see the voting patterns, the nature of dissent, whether it's just limited to the policy rate or also the stance, and how inflation expectations have evolved over this period. So these are some of the things that we'll talk about, then identifying some of the key challenges that persist and how these can be addressed to further enhance the effectiveness. This is sort of an extension of the work that we already did earlier. So we have 2 papers on inflation targeting. One is moving to inflation targeting in 2020, where we spoke about the rationale of the need to move to the IT regime. And then we had the second paper on assessing 4 years of inflation targeting framework in 2020. So the outline, just some brief introduction and brief survey of literature, then an overview of monetary policy process, inflation performance during the tenure of the 2 MPCs, because as we know, particularly during the second MPC, we had very challenging times. We had the COVID, then we had the Russia-Ukraine war. So how the Monetary Policy Committee navigated through the challenges. So that's all very interesting to see. And then some of the challenges in the conduct of the IT regime. So the first step towards the introduction of inflation targeting framework in India was the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement, which was introduced in 2015. It was an agreement between the Ministry of Finance and the RBI to move towards an inflation target. So there were targets set up for 2015 and 2016, but then ultimately it was formally, given legal foundations through the amendment to the RBI Act in 2016, where we have the target now, which is 4 plus minus 2%. We have the headline inflation, headline CPI inflation as the key target, and institutional mechanisms were also put in place to transition to an IT framework. At that time, there was a lot of interesting discourse on what should be the composition of Monetary Policy Committee, how many should be internal members, external members, voting process, veto rights. So there are a lot of discussion around that time. There were expert committee reports, namely the Jeet Patel committee report, the FSLRC, that focused on giving some recommendations on how the institutional mechanism can be refined to further improve, to have an effective IT framework. So in terms of literature, there is a plethora of literature on evaluating the performance of inflation targeting regime. The first paper, 2016 paper, is talking about the effectiveness of anchoring inflation expectations in emerging and developing economies. And the paper presents evidence that since the adoption of inflation targeting, there has been better anchoring of inflation expectations. Particularly for India, there are papers which show that the adoption has led to lower inflation and less volatile and more effectively anchored inflation. So our paper contributes to this literature by providing a comprehensive analysis of the various dimensions of of India's IT regime. First, starting with the process, so we have. We will focus on the, giving a brief overview of the monetary policy committees. Two monetary policy committees. First was constituted on September 29, 2016, and we know that MPC is constituted for a period of 4 years. During the first MPC, it was chaired by two governors, the tenure. We had Urjit Patel and Shaktikanta Das. Under Urjit Patel, the 14 meetings were held, and then 10 meetings were held from February 29 to August 2020. So this table gives a snapshot of the decisions of the policy rate and stance during the first MPC. And the horizontal line after 5th December is just to differentiate between the tenure of the two governors. So during the tenure of the first, the first MPC, but Mr. Patel's RBI, when he was the RBI governor, mostly the policy rate was unchanged, and the stance was neutral for most of the times. But there were two instances when policy rate was reduced by 25 basis points. One in the first meeting, 4th October, and then on 2nd August 2017. Interestingly, if you look at the last two meetings of the, before the horizontal line, we have the 5th October 2018 and 5th December 2018, when the policy rate was left unchanged, but the stance was changed from neutral to calibrated tightening. So there seems to be some inconsistency between the policy rate and stance for some instances, but overall we see that there is a consistency between policy rate and stance. And then from February 2019, when Mr. Das took over, mainly it was easing policy starting from 7 September 2019, and the stance was neutral. So this is an overview of the policy rate and stance during the first MPC. This I've already mentioned, and during this period we also have noticeably two unscheduled meetings during the COVID pandemic, where the policy repo rate was reduced from 5.15 to 4%. So there was mostly easing under Governor Das, and the stance was mostly neutral, and interest rate was also mostly neutral under Governor Patel. There was one interesting instance of, in 2018, June 2018 to December 2018, during this 6-month period, the repo rate was increased in June and August meeting. But during that time, the CPI inflation was relatively benign at around 4.5%. So that is something interesting. That is, there some other considerations that are guiding the conduct of Monetary Policy Committee. So that is interesting to see. This table presents the policy rate and stance for the second Monetary Policy Committee that was set up from 2020 onwards. So here we see from October 2020, the tenure of the second MPC began. And again, most of the time, the policy rate was left unchanged. But there was this period from May 2022 till February 23, when the policy rate was consistently increased because of the inflation shock, because of the Russia-Ukraine war, and the consequent shocks to inflation. And concomitantly, the stance was also changed from accommodative, which was introduced during the COVID time. The stance was changed to withdrawal of accommodation. So it's only in the recent Monetary Policy Committee meeting that we saw that the stance has now been changed to neutral. But overall, if we see from June 2022 till August 2024, we've seen that the stance has remained at withdrawal of accommodation. What about dissent? So if we look at the dissent, particularly for the second Monetary Policy Committee meeting, the first dissent happened on September 30, 2022. The tenure of the MPC started, the second MPC started in 2020, but the first dissent on the policy rate happened on September 30, 2022, when one of the members voted for a 35 basis increase, whereas the committee voted for a 50 basis increase. But from February 2024 till August 2024, we saw every meeting had instance of dissent, because we could see that there were some members who are talking about the fact that the growth is slowing down, and therefore there's this time to change the stance to neutral and start cutting rates. So we see very interesting discussions around dissent, around what is the focus of the Monetary Policy Committee members. So if you look at the minutes of the, more than the resolution statement, it's the minutes of the Monetary Policy Committee meetings that are very instructive, and they lay down emphasis on what are some of the policy priorities of the members. So there could be some members who are more dovish, some members who are hawkish amongst the MPC. This is, some kind of a word count of the MPC meetings. So if we look at the first MPC and MPC, the left panel shows the word count of the MPC, the first MPC meetings, aggregate level, and the second MPC meeting, the right-hand side. As expected, there is, so the color and the size is giving us an idea about the frequency of times those words are being used, the importance of these words in the Monetary Policy Committee discussions. And we see that on expected lines, growth and inflation are the two important key words that feature in the discussions of both the first MPC and second MPC. And again, on expected lines, what is one of the distinguishing feature is that in second MPC, we are seeing more discussion also around risks. There's discussion around global supply chain. There's discussion about risks. So because during this time, especially during the tenure of the second MPC, the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war panned out. So we see greater discussion around risks and global conditions as compared to the first MPC. So it's very useful to look at these word counts. And in the paper, we also have word counts for internal and external members, especially. And for different meetings, we have these word count, and that gives us an idea about the priorities and about the nature, the varied discussion. And that is, in fact, that is the essence of having a monetary policy committee to get a diversified set of opinion around the trajectory of growth and inflation and around the policy. Coming to inflation performance, so these are the two graphs. That the first top graph shows the year-on-year change in inflation and its key components of the first MPC. The second graph shows the trajectory of inflation during the second MPC. The black line shows the headline inflation. The maroon line shows the food and beverages, blue line shows fuel and light, and then we have the core inflation, which is orangish line. What we see is that during the first MPC meeting, if you look at the headline inflation, which is the black line, it was broadly within the target. It was range bound. It was only towards the end of 2019 that we saw the headline inflation rising. And this is before the COVID shock. There was, the headline inflation started rising before the COVID shock due to increase in food prices. So that is a key summary of the inflation performance. But if you look at the second MPC, the first few months were again marred by inflation breaching the upper threshold of 6%. In 2021, inflation again became high and volatile from 22 onwards. And 2022 was the period when the RBI's MPC officially failed to achieve the inflation target. So according to the law, if for 3 consecutive quarters, inflation remains above 6%, then it is considered a failure to achieve inflation target. And that is what was seen in the first 3 quarters of the calendar year 2022. And therefore, once the data came out for the month of September, after that, an additional MPC meeting as per the law, as per the RBI Act, was convened to discuss and draft a report which is to be sent to the government about the reasons for the deviation of inflation from the target, and the steps that are being taken to again restore inflation within the target. So in this tenure in this period from 2016 to 2024, we've had one instance when inflation has breached the target, and we say that there's a failure to achieve inflation target, because for 3 consecutive quarters during 2022, that is 3 quarters of the calendar year, inflation remained above the 6% mark. So that was one of the important aspects of inflation during the tenure of the second MPC. But if we look at the overall inflation performance, if we look at the mean and standard deviation of headline inflation, food and beverage inflation, and core inflation, and if we compare the pre-inflation targeting regime with the post-inflation targeting regime, we find that overall the headline inflation as well as food and core inflation is lower in the post-IT regime as compared to the pre-IT regime, and that's true for headline as well as the constituents. We look at the food, beverage inflation and core inflation. Again, the post-IT regime, we have categorized them into pre-COVID and post-COVID to get a sense of how COVID disruptions impacted the standard deviation, the volatility, and the average inflation. Again, we see that on expected lines, post-COVID headline inflation is higher than the pre-COVID, but again, it is lower than the pre-IT regime. So overall, we can say with certainty that inflation has turned less volatile post the adoption of it is less, and even the volatility is lower post the adoption of the inflation targeting framework. The right side shows the standard deviation, and the numbers show that volatility is lower in the post-IT regime, post-IT period. For both headline as well as its constituents. Now, with this brief overview, we talk about some of the challenges in the conduct of the IT regime that could impact the effectiveness of the inflation targeting regime. One is the impossible trilemma. There are instances where the Reserve Bank of India has to grapple between the constraints of the 3 corners of the impossible trinity, because there are trade-offs between having an independent monetary policy, an open capital account, and a fixed exchange rate. There have been also instances where there have been conflicts between monetary and debt management. This was not that pronounced in the pre-IT regime because at that time there was no explicit target. But since 2016, when the Act provides the explicit target, which is to manage inflation and to bring inflation within the 4% band, there are these instances where somewhere there could be a conflict between monetary conduct and debt management. Noticeably, the monetary policy transmission has improved since the adoption of the IT regime, and we talk about in the paper various channels of monetary policy transmission. We talk about the banking sector transmission through the bond market. Particularly for the banking sector, transmission has improved. It's not perfect, but it has improved since the adoption of the external benchmark rate. Earlier it was a base rate. Now we have the external benchmark rate, which are more closely aligned with the policy repo rate. So there we see that at least on the fresh lending rate, we see that they are more aligned with the changes in the policy rate. And the other suggestion is that there's need for a longer time series of inflation expectations. Right now, in the household expectation series, we have the maximum duration that is for RBI series is 1 year. It may be useful to have a 3-year and 5-year inflation expectation series to see whether inflation expectations are firmly anchored to inflation. Those short-term shocks could have an implication on short-term inflation expectation, but if your long-term inflation expectation are still aligned to the 4% target, then that is a greater effective measure of success of the IT framework. And that is what we see in some of the other countries, that they have inflation expectation series of varying duration. So that is something that is a suggestion that, maybe RBI is already tracking. We do get a sense from the RBI's annual the monetary policy report that there is a long-term time series, but that's not coming from RBI. That's part of the professional forecaster survey. So we just talk about some of these challenges. So there have been periods when RBI has actively focused on managing exchange rate fluctuation since the adoption of the inflation targeting regime. Particularly one of the period, the June and August 2018 period, when inflation was quite modest, but arguably the rate increases were influenced or driven by external factors like depreciation pressures on the INR USD rate due to emerging market crisis. There was a brief spell of emerging market crisis triggered by economic instability in Turkey that could have played out or played a role in the interest rate decisions, because during that time, if you look at the headline inflation, it was quite modest during 2018, the first half. So that is one instance, but of late, since 2022, we have seen that there has been greater emphasis on exchange rate management. And why this is critical is that when there is a greater emphasis on exchange rate management, it will have implications for the reserve money. Because if RBI is continually managing the exchange rate, it is increasing its forex reserve, the reserve money will increase. That could have implications for inflation target at a time when inflation is still above 4%. And then there is this question of whether that intervention is a sterilized intervention or unsterilized intervention. So in both the cases, the implications will play out differently. So there is a case for moving more towards a flexible exchange rate so that there is a greater movement towards monetary policy independence, and that would further arguably enhance the effectiveness of the inflation targeting regime. So this is one graph to show that the annualized volatility of the rupee dollar rate has decreased, particularly since 2013. Also, if we look at the scale of intervention, it has increased considerably since 2022 from both the purchase and the sales side. So that is again giving an indication that RBI is managing the exchange rate. So out of the three pillars, it is focusing on having a moving more towards a fixed exchange rate, and at a time when we are already a de facto open capital account. We have moved towards an open capital account. That would mean that monetary policy independence would take a hit at some point. So this we have already talked about, but just also if we look at the movement in the dollar rate, the dollar index and rupee dollar rate, we see that the dollar index just another example is that during March 22 and July 23, the US Fed raised interest rate 11 times, pushing the federal fund rate to above 5%, and this led to sharp fluctuations in the value of the dollar. So in a flexible exchange rate setting, it would have led to fluctuations in the rupee also, but during this period, rupee exhibited stability. So this is just a comparison of the dollar index and the rupee dollar rate during that, we want to focus on the period when the US Fed embarked on the tightening of monetary policy. The dollar index showed considerable volatility, but the rupee dollar rate did not. So these are just some instances to show that despite a movement towards the adoption of inflation targeting regime, the Reserve Bank of India continues to grapple with the challenges of the impossible trinity. Again, as in a comparative perspective, here we are looking at exchange rates of some comparable EMs, comparable emerging markets, and the exchange rate, just for purposes of comparison, exchange rate is indexed to 100 at October 2016. October 2016 was the time when the inflation targeting was introduced formally. So since then, we see, if we compare the exchange rate movements, we see the blue is the rupee dollar rate. In a comparative framework also, if we see, the rupee dollar rate has moved in a narrow range as compared to some of the movements in some of the other currencies. Also, there is a striking similarity between the trajectory of the US Fed's funds rate and the repo rate, though it is true that the RBI's decisions are influenced by domestic consideration. There are some instances where, particularly on the 4th of May 2022, there was an unscheduled meeting for started raising for increasing the interest rate, and that was also the day when the US Fed was expected to start raising interest rate. So because currency defense is already is one of the objective or is one of the priority, therefore for currency defense, interest rate movements are also being guided by whatever is happening in the US Fed. So the other is the conflict between monetary and debt management, and there are a lot of reports talking about the value of having a separation of monetary policy and debt management, and this becomes more prominent at a time when we have a legal mandate for the Reserve Bank of India, which is to manage inflation, and there have been instances where the monetary policy decisions have been guided by the trajectory of the 10-year bond yield rather than domestic inflation consideration. So there was period we've mentioned in the paper 2018 period when the call rate was near the repo rate. So there was no need for liquidity interventions in the form of open market operation. But because the 10-year bond yield was rising, and to bring down the 10-year bond yield, the open market operations were conducted. So it could create a conflict between monetary policy and debt management that could confuse the market participants as to the objectives of the use of the instruments. I already talked about this. Anchoring of inflation expectations. So the black line is the actual inflation, and these three lines are showing the inflation expectation. And inflation expectations, we have the current perception, the 3 month ahead and 1 month ahead. We have three series on inflation expectation. There have been periods when there is a considerable divergence between household inflation expectations and the trajectory of the inflation, the actual inflation, and therefore to address some of these inconsistencies, it is also, as I mentioned earlier, could be useful to have a longer time series of household inflation expectations, that is 5-year and 10-year, to get a greater sense of how effective the inflation expectations are aligned to the headline inflation. On the transmission part, as I said, transmission through banking sector has improved in the recent years. Since the introduction of external benchmark-based lending rate, we have a few graphs which shows that the weighted average lending rate on fresh loans is closely aligned to the policy rate. We show through the easing cycle and the tightening cycle that during the easing cycle, which was during the COVID time when policy rate was eased, we see that the weighted average lending rate was also reduced. And during the tightening cycle, the weighted average lending rate was increased. On the fresh loans, the transmission is faster as compared to the lending rate on outstanding loans. But as compared to the previous regime, when the interest rates were benchmarked to the base rate, we see that there has been an improvement in the transmission to the bank lending as well as the bank deposit rates. The problem or the scope of improvement is where we talk about transmission through the bond market. So while short-term money market rates are more sensitive and they are aligned to, they follow the trajectory of the repo rate. But when we talk about the transmission to medium and long-term GSEC yields, they do not tend to follow the changes in the repo rate. And one critical metric to assess this is the term premium, which is the difference between the 10-year yield and the 1-year yield. So when the monetary policy tightening is happening, the term premium should widen. When monetary policy easing is happening, term premium should ease. But we don't see that happening because the short-term yields are much more responsive to the 10-year bond yields. 10-year bond yields also rise, but they don't rise to the extent of short-term bond yields, and therefore the term premium, the way it is expected to move as per the standard economic theory, we don't see that happening. So in conclusion, the adoption of the IT framework is a crucial reform in India's financial sector. Inflation has reduced and become less volatile. There's a lot of varied discussion. We show in the paper that there's a lot of varied discussion around various aspects of inflation in the Monetary Policy Committee meetings. There's discussion around stance. There's discussion around policy rate. There's discussion about real interest rate. There's discussion about potential rate. So there is the nature of discussions have considerably, they are enriched, but there are some problems. Particularly since India has become increasingly financially integrated into the global economy, we can't go back on an open capital account. So to ensure a monetary policy independence, there is a need to move towards a flexible exchange rate. Other suggestions include having a more wider range of macro data, maybe some assessment about the potential growth rate, and having a more liquid market in government securities so that the transmission in the bond market also happens more faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. We'll do both of them.
So, thank you. So this is a ongoing work with my co-author. He is in RBI, so this disclaimer actually applies to him. So since the COVID pandemic broke out, there is the supply disruption in determining the dynamics of inflation around the world became one of the major topic of discussion among the researchers and policymakers. So we look at the India story. What is the part of the India story? The outline of the talk is we set the background and alternative measures of supply disruptions for India. What could be the alternative measures? Then in order to assess its impact on the dynamics of inflation in India, what are the conceptual framework and the choice of variables that we consider? Finally, findings and conclusion. So, average global inflation was stable at 2.5% during the last decade of 2011 to 2020. In 2020, when the pandemic broke out, global inflation started rising and it increased on average to 5.7% post-pandemic. There was a spike, it increased, the global inflation was modest during 2020 on account of negative oil price shock, but it started rising after that and had a peak to 8%. And all these were mainly because of the disruption of supply chains, the supply of labor, material, and everything. And that led to this shortage of output and increase in inflation. So since then, there is a ever expanding literature on how supply disruption affects inflation in different countries, in cross country, in specific countries. Most of the literature are focused to developed economies. Some are available for some emerging economies and among the developing countries is Africa is one of the focus. Now, in all these studies, the measure of supply disruption was captured by Global Supply Chain Pressure Index developed by Federal Bank of New York. So so what is this index? This index basically it includes information from transportation sector and manufacturing. In the transportation sector, it looks at the Baltic Dry Index, which is an index provided by the Baltic Exchange. It's a community of shipping corporations. They provide the price for transport of dry bulk across more than 20 routes. The other index is Harpex index, that's provided by another brokerage firm of shipping corporations, and they give the charter prices for container ships. Apart from these two indices, this GSCPI uses air freight cost indices from US Labor Bureau and Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing across seven interconnected countries: China, Euro area, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, United Kingdom, and United States. So for an example, this graph shows that the red line is the GSCPI, the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, and US CPI inflation, the orange one. So global supply pressure seems to lead US inflation since the beginning of 2021. So when we now So now if we look at what happened to India, as already Radhika has discussed, that there was a time when Indian inflation was in a high inflation rate regime before it adopted the flexible inflation targeting. It was 8.8% average inflation. So we considered February, the agreement date, as the agreement month, as the date for IT adoption, because that gives a forward signal to the market that it's going to be stabilized, inflation going to be stabilized. So it was 8.8%, but it was stable to 4.3% post FIT, and till the period the pandemic broke out, but increased to 5.7% afterwards. And there was many occurrences when the inflation, the CPI inflation was exceeded the upper bound of the RBI's tolerance band. So, however, there is no, the literature actually lacking the India part of the story, how this supply pressure has affected inflation in India. So we explored this, the effect of the supply chain disruption for Indian inflation in two alternative ways. One is just empirical analysis, a time varying VAR model, to understand how the relation has changed over time at different periods, like before pandemic, after pandemic. Second is to develop, by developing a small scale DSG model, to understand that what are the different kind of the relative importance of different kind of shocks that played a role during the COVID time. So it was not only the supply disruption, we had Ukraine war in the post-COVID period. So what are the relative contribution of these different kinds of shocks? So, but here, given the time constraint, I'm going to stick to the empirical part of our analysis. For India, we look at three alternative measures of supply chain disruption. One is the standard, this GSCPI, which is what the index that is used by all studies in the literature. The second is RBI has developed a index of supply chain pressure for India. So this table here shows that what are the kind of indicators they have used in constructing that index. So apart from those three indices of Baltic Dry index and Harpex index and PMI and US air freight data, RBI looks at several domestic information such as rail cargo, then track freight, domestic air cargo. These are some of the factors here. Suppliers delivery time that they take from S&P's primary PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index. So this is a long list. So, and also it gives weightage to India's trade relation with US. So what is the freight rates between air freight rates from US to Asia, US Asia and Asia to US. So these are the main indicators in this ISPI. The third, so here's a full list, and the third index is the input cost component of HSBC India PMI that we also look at. So these are mainly the three alternative ways that we try to capture the supply disruption in this study. So when we look at how this GSCPI and Indian CPI inflation look like if we put them together. So we see that post 2021, the CPI inflation in India looks like gives some response to the GSCPI. So there is GSCPI has led the CPI inflation, the headline inflation, but in a mild way. It's not that there is a very one-to-one kind of relation that we can see here. When we compare CPI inflation, ISCPI is completely the opposite trend. So you see, when the CPI inflation was going down, ISCPI was going up. So it seems that there may not be any relationship holding in between these two series. Now the third index, and here we see that the input cost index shows a sort of a one-to-one movement with the CPI inflation movement during towards the later part of the 2020. So from the period of pandemic, it looks like that the input cost pressure captures the supply disruption better for India. So now we do a empirical analysis. We try to see how this relationship are actually played in a time varying VAR model, because the relationship can also, the extent of relationship, degree and pattern, everything can change, might have changed during pre and post during and post COVID periods. So what are in order to understand that relation, we need to control with other variables. So what are the other variables that we consider for? And that choice of the other variables are based on a simple Neo-Keynesian structure, standard dynamic IS curve, expectation augmented Phillips curve. So where demand, so IS curve showing demand responding to the demand condition in the past, then real interest rate, which is the combination, which is the nominal interest rate minus the expected inflation, the first equation, and the movements in exchange rate. Aggregate supply, the expectation augmented Phillips curve. So current inflation, it's determined by the past inflation as well as the economic agents' perspective about the future inflation and demand conditions and exchange rate. Then monetary and this Phillips curve is also augmented with other kinds of variables which can be like supply side, some other supply side variables such as global food inflation or WPI food inflation. WPI food inflation takes into account the domestic supply conditions. So these are the variables that that might affect the CPI inflation in India. Finally, the monetary policy response of the central bank is determined by the policy rate is a function of the policy rate in the past periods, then the expectation about the future inflation, demand condition, and a shock to policy rate. So that's the basic structure, and also the variables like global food inflation and WPI food articles inflation are chosen based on the existing empirical literature that has been found that these variables play some significant role in determining the inflation in India. So this is a description of the data. So since we are estimating this model in a monthly frequency. So here we demand condition we capture by non-food credit growth, but that's a caveat, this under a caveat, and it other demand related indicators can be used and explored, and that's in our future agenda, like a combination of the some sort of a coincident indicator or something can be used in place of just one indicator like non-food credit. Then 3 months ahead average expected inflation of households from RBI household survey is taken as a expectation of inflation. Then we have repo rate, exchange rate, and global food prices and WPI food articles prices. So these are basically the variables that we consider for this. Now we look at we estimate a time varying vector autoregression model, and these are some of the impulse responses to of CPI inflation to a shock to GSCPI at different periods. For example, one is in April in 2016. So one shock. So since it's a time varying model, so the impulse responses can vary according to when the shock has been worked. Yeah, so one is in April 2016. The second below is that's April 2021. And we see that in both cases there is no relation. The blue line is the response, and the black dotted lines are the 90% confidence band. And we see that these bands are lying to the opposite direction of the zero. So there is no much difference between the impact and the no impact. So, given this is the more or less the kind of pattern we find when we look at the impact of shock at any period of time in the sample. So, however, we find that there is a when we give a shock to the WPI food articles inflation, there is a after one period there is a significant response. And so we find that an increase in WPI food articles in inflation increases CPI inflation after 1 month of the shock, and the impact subsides afterwards. Similarly, we also find a relation when we look at the shock to the global food inflation. So since we get some, at least for some periods when there is a shock, we see some impact on CPI. Now we track the 1 period response of CPI inflation after 1 period of shock to WPI food articles inflation, when the shock is occurring at all the points of time over the sample. And then we find that WPI food articles inflation was one of the major drivers of CPI inflation till the pandemic broke out. So during 2014, April 2014 to December 2019. So April 2014 is the period before the inflation targeting was adopted, and it lasted till it significantly lasted till the December 2019. So before the pandemic broke out, it is the domestic market shocks that was the major driver of inflation in India. We also find that a global inflation shock plays a role, but it prevailed even after the pandemic started. So it's a bit longer period till July 2021, and the shock also became significant from March 2016. That's after the adoption of inflation targeting. Now we look at the role of ISPI of RBI. Here we find that in some when we look at the pre-pandemic period, a shock in the pre-pandemic years, there is a negative relation, significant negative relation. You can see that there is a negative relation starting from after. If there is a shock to the ISPI, the CPI inflation declines after 3 months of the shock, and that decline is significant. However, if we give a shock during post-COVID time, then we see that the pattern of the shock has changed. So it has now shown a positive impact, although not significant. So this corroborates the fact that we have seen a different, the trends of PI and CPI inflation were moving to the opposite direction. So that is coming captured into this inflation impulse response patterns. Now, if we look at the input cost index, again, we see that there is a significant impact after 1 month of the shock. So we plot again the time varying responses over the sample period. So first, this shows the impact, the time varying impact of CPI inflation after 1 month of the shock at every period of the shock in every period of the sample. So it shows that the impact was these two red lines are the period till it was significant. That will show later. I will show later. So here we see that the impact started rising from August 2016, and it became it came to a peak in April 2023. But that peak was not within the period of significance. So now, if you look at if we plot the significance levels, we see that this is the period to August 2016 to January 2022, the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. This was the input cost played a role in driving the CPI inflation. So what are our major findings? So we find that different factors were driving the headline inflation with their significance changing over time. So it's not that they are fixed. Some different shocks became significant at different points of time. Supply disruption moderately contributed to inflation in India via input cost channel during and post-pandemic period. That's what we have seen. Apart from this cost push channel of input cost pressure channel of supply disruption, WPI food articles inflation and global food inflation are also two drivers that played some role in driving the headline inflation. So it seems that it is required a suitable measure for capturing the supply disruption for India is needed, because the ISPI, it shows a negative relation. It's not showing it's not catching the inflation dynamics of India. So a supply disruption measure taking into account the information from the domestic supply disruptions, because most of the, other than some freight, truck freight rate and air cargo domestic rate, there is not much information from the how the food market supply disruptions are not taken into account, this ISCPI. So if the information from those sectors can be incorporated, maybe we can get a better and more comprehensive role we can find of input cost of supply disruption for India. Till now, given whatever the available measures, we see a moderate impact, but that's through the input cost pressure channel. But maybe there are some other information that are not yet captured that we need to look at, and that may give us more information regarding the role of supply disruption. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Radhika, Kavita, for inviting me to this meeting. I'm very happy to have this opportunity of applying my mind once again on monetary policy issues in India, which has been a long time since I looked at these things. I should also mention that I invited my colleague, Dr. Janak Raj, who was a member of the MPC and, of course, executive director in charge of monetary policy in the Reserve Bank. So if you feel like commenting after me, you might want to do that. I want an apology to Rudrani, which is that her paper was very long. And it only came, was it day before yesterday night or yesterday morning? Yeah, so, you know, my capacity to do these things is now rapidly declining. So that took a long time. So I'm afraid I did not look, but I, of course, listened very rapidly to attention, with attention. And I'll say a little few things, but not really informed comments. I'm also happy that this paper, actually, well, it's a pity that of the three authors on your paper, the two I know are not here. And the one I didn't know is here and who presented it. So you must have done all the work, obviously, and they just put their names on it. So I'm glad that my former colleague, Ila Patnaik, has not completely forsaken academic pursuits, however misguided they may be, if I may say so, after having entered a golden cage with the Birlas. I'm very happy that she's continued to do some work and keep encouraging her. Your other author, Rajeshwari, said, I met when she was a graduate student at Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz. In some sense, wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, enthusiastic graduate student. And at the urging of her advisor, Nirvikar, my old friend Nirvikar, who also had association, I think, with an IPFP, asked her to make the journey from Santa Cruz to Stanford, where I was at that time in 2009, to see me. But judging from this paper, she clearly remained completely unscathed from that content of that meeting. So Thank you for inviting with this. As I said, it's a pity that the authors that I know are not here, but congratulations to you for having done this. First, you all have clearly done a great service to the monetary policy and analytical community. They're putting together the full history of inflation targeting in India since its formal adoption. I don't know if this is available as in one place, right? The documentation of all the monetary policy decisions by the MPCs, key points from the meetings, minutes, the voting pattern, also the key views of participants, including dissents. I'm sure very invaluable for researchers and other observers alike. So in some sense, thank you very much on their behalf, really, because it's not easy to get all this stuff in one place. This paper is also very well written. It's unusual for economists to write in English, which you have. So it's fully understandable. So really, it's a pleasure to read it, and mostly devoid of jargon. I wish I could write as well as you do. And if I did, more people would end up reading my writings. Now, let me start by giving you my priors on inflation targeting. As many of you would know, I have never been a votary of inflation targeting framework, either in India or elsewhere. It's not just on India. Why? To my mind, by its very framework, the IT framework, inflation targeting framework, turns monetary policy and macroeconomics into what I would characterize as Mickey Mouse economics, or a hydraulic discipline. That is, inflation goes up, so increase interest rates. Inflation goes down, reduce interest rates. So it's almost like a hydraulic system. If the economy was so simple, right, we wouldn't have so many professors of economics in macroeconomics, so many students, so much research. It's straightforward. Why are the MPC committee meetings, what, 2 days long?
Almost 3 days.
Almost 3 days long, right? There's only one variable. Why the hell did they spend 3 days? And this is common to almost all MPCs. So it must be the case, right, that they're discussing many things in the economy and then coming to a decision on one variable. It doesn't make sense to me, quite frankly. I'm not criticizing the Reserve Bank, but the whole framework in general. So with all the knowledge that we have on macroeconomics, how economies work, their complexity, and so on, Rudrani, your work, your careful work on the impact of different supply disruptions to inflation is an example of that. That is, lots of complexities that show up. Russia may invade Ukraine, right? Israel may bash the hell out of Gazans, and so on. So there may be a drought in the country. So there are many things that happen which affect both output as well as prices. So what is this nonsense? On this issue, I speak like that. What is this nonsense of saying that inflation targeting framework where the central bank knows what the inflation should be and it can manage it with one variable, that is the policy interest rate. So I have never understood this. I've taught at Yale and so on. I've also taught with John Taylor at Stanford, but I could never get a sense from them, even among the high priests of this stuff. So you're not in a minority, you're in the majority. I'm in maybe a single person minority, but I've never understood this. How can we pretend that the policy interest rate really determines inflation outcomes? Obviously, I'm not denying, obviously not, that the level of the interest rate, the changes in the interest rate obviously have some impact on output and prices. No question about that. But the question is, can 0.25% changes make a difference in anything? Which is what becomes the standard. And I simply, sometimes I wish that life was that simple. So the sort of the touching belief in inflation targeting framework, to my mind, is almost like a religion, not very different from the Catholic's faith in what the Pope says in his rare utterings. Um, so, um, so my young colleagues here, you and your co-authors, have a very honorable pedigree in terms of thinking in monetary policy. Now, both theoretically and empirically, what is also said when we are taught monetary policy, macro, that the both theoretically and also from empirical information, that the impact of monetary policy actions have long and variable lags. And they usually talk about 18 to 24 months. Right? What is the implication? The implication is that if today the Monetary Policy Committee is taking some action, either raising the interest rate or reducing the interest rate, they have some information what's going to happen 18 to 24 months from now. And what they're doing today is going to impact that, not what's happening today. Okay? So I don't understand. We know, as you have also documented, that we know that everyone's projections are always wrong. I'm not saying that negatively in the sense that, look, they're doing a bad job, but that's part of it. That is, any projections that you make from available data, something else happens, something else changes. So you may make the best projections from the available, with best methodology, with the available information, but to pretend that the Monetary Policy Committee or the central bank is able to take monetary policy actions today whose impact will be 18, 24 months from now because they have knowledge of what's going to happen 18 to 24 months from now. So also it doesn't make sense to me. And as I said, I don't understand why the high priesthood of the economics profession believes in this. You can take any central bank's inflation forecast, the IMF's inflation forecasts, even Janak Raj's inflation forecasts, always wrong. Okay, and not because they're doing a bad job, but that's the nature of things. Okay, so it seems to me that the implementation of the IT framework in a practical fashion is neither based on sound theory nor on sound empirical investigations. That's my view. How did IT come about? First, it is very interesting to recall that central banks did not have inflation control as a major objective till maybe the mid 1990s. Okay, so but central banks have been there for a very long time, hundreds of years in different countries. Reserve Bank has been there since 1935. So this has only come since the 1990s. Why? I think it's because in the 1970s, there was an explosion of inflation everywhere. Part of it because of the Vietnam War. Part of it was because of the oil price shock, supply disruptions, which went everywhere. And so it was really out of control everywhere. And Paul Volcker, as the chair of the Federal Reserve, really did a sledgehammer. What is interesting is that in his communication, he didn't say I'm raising interest rates because he felt that would not be acceptable to anyone. He talked about reducing the money supply aggregates, okay, which inflation targets are useless. But that's what he did. But that resulted in a real huge increase in interest rates. To give you an idea, I was then in Washington, living in Washington, my first job, age of 30, in the World Bank. I got an opportunity to buy an apartment. You know, the interest rate, 30-year mortgage I had to pay was 14.75%. So that was the kind of sledgehammer used to bring down inflation, which has succeeded. So obviously, and that's correct, if you use that kind of sledgehammer, it will have an impact. You obviously are going to slow down all of economic activity. And, inflation came down. So to my mind, that's how this whole thing arose. Second, in the same period, the emerging markets, very high inflation, We did not, by the way. It is the region of 78% on average from the mid 50s to mid 90s. Sometimes early 90s it was higher, but ours were lower compared to the other countries. And of course, there was a complete explosion in Latin America and some African countries. So, in that sense, also, inflation targeting as a slogan, if not a framework, was very attractive, quite rightly. And particularly Latin American countries were very quick in adopting inflation targeting. And the fact is that since then, in general, except for bouts in Argentina, maybe Bolivia, that Latin American inflation has been much lower than it was before. So in that sense, one can say inflation targeting was successful, but a co-determinant to my mind was that it really put focus on the fiscal policies of all Latin American countries, which are always very, very expansionary. And to a great extent, because of this framework, minds got focused. And they did that. Uh, so uh, the so in that sense, one can understand the popularity of inflation targeting. Now, how does it work in principle? Interest rate increases, obviously, presumably restraint in demand. Presumably, then you have a better supply-demand equilibrium. So the pressure on prices comes down, therefore lower inflation. But what are the assumptions? One, that the large part of the economy is interest rate sensitive. Is that true in a developing country? Why is the wretched IMF pushing inflation down, inflation targeting frameworks down the throats of almost all African countries? I remember when I was on the IMF board, there was a meeting, I think it was in Ghana or one of the West African countries, where they said it may not have been Ghana, where they said the credit GDP ratio was 3%. Now, how the hell do you think that inflation targeting with interest rate changes is going to make any impact on the economy? But that's what they're doing. That's the IMF orthodoxy. Okay. So as I said, I'm giving me a puzzle. I don't understand. Having been, since I was in charge of monetary policy for 7 years, 2002 to 9, maybe I'm obsolete, which some of your authors certainly believe, some of your colleagues certainly believe. But nonetheless, I've given you my reasons. So one is that large part of the economy should be interest rate sensitive. Two, there should be efficient monetary policy transmission. How does that happen on the bond market? It means you've got to have an efficient bond market. Monetary policy has nothing to do with setting up an efficient bond market. The Reserve Bank does, or the central bank does, which is exactly what they've been doing, but it's not the MPC. MPC can do nothing to influence the bond market except the interest rate changes. And similarly, you talk to the banks, it has improved. That's because on the regulatory side, the Reserve Bank has put regulations or directives, or what you would call them, on how to calculate interest rates with an external benchmark, right? So what I'm saying is the monetary policy transmission improved because the Reserve Bank does other things also. The FSLRC, of which one of your colleagues was a member or a writer, right, advocated that regulation supervision should be taken away from the central bank. Now, how can you do that? It's nonsensical, right? Maybe some contempt because the head of that committee was a former Supreme Court justice. But my point is that even in the UK, where this folly was being copied from, they separated the regulation supervision from the Bank of England. I think it was 1996 or something, when the Labour Party first came in after a long period of the Conservative Party. But after the North Atlantic financial crisis in 2008-9, they brought it back because they figured out the central bank has to have those powers, even though the MPC may have nothing to do with it. Okay? But that's affecting the whole interest rate monetary policy transmission. So Then the question arises, how much of this is relevant for emergency? So much for my sermon on inflation targeting. Now let me come to your paper. I made a list of statements that I don't agree with. Okay, which doesn't mean they're wrong. Well, I think they're wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. Okay. One, India made a significant advance in the monetary policy framework by adopting inflation targeting. That's just a straightforward statement. Because of, again, I have my priors, you all must have yours. So that's just a straightforward assertion. Okay. Two, the framework setting involves setting an official target, explicitly prioritizing low and stable inflation as the primary objective, which is from the RBI Act, which you quote. But you missed out the second paragraph, the second phrase. Must be deliberately. Okay? Must be deliberately. Which says, while keeping in mind the objective of growth. Why do you do that? It's there in the Act. Because you're cherry picking to bolster your case and inflation target. Please don't mind what I say, because that's how I talk, okay? Because I respect your work. Okay? Then he says, arguably bolstered the credibility of the RBI. By what measurement is the credibility of the RBI been increased since institution of the inflation targeting framework? I would say that it is actually quite amazing. Look, I was an outsider to the RBI. I was earlier in the government doing other things, went in 2002 to 9. But I think that the credibility of the RBI has been extremely high since its founding 90 years ago. So I don't know how you can say that the credibility of the RBI has been increased by this new framework, unless there's some evidence of what people may or may not have said. Now, I don't have much evidence either, what I just said, except in talking to people and asking them, particularly, for example, that in the bad old days, when the RBI was, you had to go to the RBI to get foreign exchange for anything. Okay. So, I mean, very obviously, few people that I would ask, I said, was there a lot of corruption? Because that's clearly something would lead to a lot of corruption. But I want money to go to study. I want money to buy an air ticket. You know, you had to get RBI permission to buy an air ticket. Anything with foreign exchange, because even if you paid in rupees, it implied you're actually paying in dollars. So what I'm saying is that I was very surprised talking to various people in the private sector. That was there, and of course the industry had to go to them all the time. You get foreign exchange release for imports and so on, foreign technology payments, all kinds of stuff, right? I asked many friends in industry, look, was there feeling of corruption in the RBI? Till today, I've not heard anyone saying that. Now, I'm sure there was. It can't be that there wasn't. Okay. But what I'm saying is that the credibility of the RBI has been very high all through. Of course, it's gone some ups. It has some ups and downs, obviously, like anything else. Then you also claimed that the inflation targeting framework requires, this is a core part of the paper, moving away from a pegged exchange rate to a floating exchange rate. And second, establish a separate agency for debt management, separate public debt management agency. Again, I don't see that stated anywhere in any inflation targeting framework. Right? Now, you have a view that that's necessary. But then it's not clear why. And I'll come to that in a second. Then you said, since the inflation targeting framework, the RBI, in terms of transparency, has put out timely and regular publication of monetary policy statements. Now, certainly after 2002, we had a monetary policy statement after every decision. I don't know before that.
Yeah, no, I think what they're seeing perhaps the minutes which are.
No, not the minutes, I'm not the statement. You're quite right. Minutes, that's right, minutes were not there. No, but the point is that even before, so you can't say that this happened after that. In fact, the criticism we used to get is that they're too long. Okay, they're not clear. Dr. Y.B. Reddy, the governor, one of his usual quips was, "I'm just sharing my confusion with everyone else." Okay, but there was a seriousness to that. Going back to what I said with Mickey Mouse economics, that the economy is a complex thing. When you're communicating what you've done, you need to communicate the complexity with which you have dealt with. So just as I was leaving the RBI, we had a new communications person who was coming in. She was from the IMF. And I had long discussion. I said, look, she said the same thing. They're too complicated. They're going to, I said, that's what they're supposed to do. They're not, they're totally transparent. They're more transparent than almost any other MPC statement you'll come across. That you may not like it is different, but you can't accuse the people in them for non-transparency. And they were done regularly, on time. Yes, there were no minutes because there wasn't a committee. There couldn't be any minutes. Then the discipline of this principle of floating exchange rate is enshrined in the doctrine of impossible trinity. I suggest you read my paper, which has a internal contradiction in terms in the title, which is Managing the Impossible Trinity. It's a contradiction in terms because you can't manage something that is impossible. Okay. But the point is, the assumption here, right, is that you have to be at a corner. Open capital account, fixed exchange rate, independent monetary policy. Why? There's no theory which says you have to be on a corner, right? There's no theory which says that. Yes, impossible trinity has been there in the literature, so you're in good company. But, so what I've always said is, this is wrong. You have to be somewhere in the middle of the triangle where I don't know. In other words, you want a relatively market-determined floating exchange rate, which reflects the movements in the real economy. You want an open capital account to a great extent, but not 100%. And of course, with all these things, you can still have an independent monetary policy. Now, what do I mean by this? To give examples. What have we done? And actually, what is interesting to me is that when I went as executive director of the IMF, it just happened by coincidence. The very first meeting I attended, which was October 2012, was a discussion on the new policy paper on managing capital flows. So the hype to which I had contributed in terms of earlier lectures and stuff. So the high priests of floating market-determined exchange rates and against control of the capital account 12 years ago formally changed their view. So you can no longer say that this is essential because it has been shown repeatedly that you can't have an open capital account with no capital flow management. Now, it doesn't mean that you have very strong control. What do we have, for example? We have pretty much free FDI. Not totally free because you don't let China come in and so on, right? We have pretty much free portfolio investment in equity. Again, not 100% because we have some limits on how much portfolio investors can own in a particular company. So there are all kinds of limits to these things. They're kind of calibrated. Then what do? We have these NRI deposits, which give interest rates somewhat higher on dollars than the market interest rates of bank deposits in the US. What have we been doing all the time? We've been fiddling with them all the time, which is when we need Forex, we raise that interest rate. The margin between what we are offering is almost risk-free because the effectively guarantee of the government, although not technically, and the bank interest rates there. And we've also aggressively reduced the margin when we had too much flow of capital. That's another measure that we use. Okay. So, but at the same time, if you look at the capital flows to India, I would say since the early 2000s, 2003, 2004 or something, as proportion of GDP, it won't be less than in developed countries, which are open markets. But it's managed. Now you can argue that, look, how do you know how to manage? That's a good argument. But you have to manage. I'll give you another example. What we had to do 2007-8. In 2007-8, just before the Lehman crisis, in fiscal 2007-8, I think it was, yeah, we received about $100 billion net, about 10% of GDP. If we hadn't managed it, put them in reserves, done sterilization, done market stabilization bonds, it would have been a disaster. Okay. So what I'm saying, our own experience tells us that, look, it's essential. At the same time, as far as I know, we practice independent monitoring. Objective, then debt, I'll come back to this in a second. Objective of debt management, to me, is to make low cost debt available to the government, which is a conflict with monetary policy. There are two comments here. One, yes, of course, the debt manager has to be, the objective has to be to manage the debt of the government with as low rates cost as possible. That's correct. But how is it a conflict? How is it conflict with monetary policy? Now, as it happens, we realized this in the RBI, I think around 2003-4, I think. It used to be, for example, when I first joined in 2002, the deputy governor in charge, and my predecessors, the person in charge of monetary policy was also in charge of debt management. But then the FRBM came, which then disallowed the RBI to, they could no longer subscribe to government debt. So then we separated out debt management from the monetary policy function. So all our colleagues did the debt management. Yes, of course, they were present in the meetings to do with monetary policy. But I don't recall any discussion where, so no, because of this, you should do this. So this is a canard that has been repeated ad nauseum since the late 2000s, with absolutely no evidence, to my mind, very little reason. Second, what do we mean by an independent debt management agency? Look, debt issuance by the government is a key core sovereign function. No independent authority can do that. It has to be the government of India, that is Ministry of Finance. So the reality is that if you think about any debt management office, it has what they call a front office, which does all the market work, that is putting out the securities, maybe trading in them or whatever. There's a back office, which keeps all the accounts of how much has been issued, who's holding them, etc., for each instrument. The back office. That's totally accounting. So in India, it's the front office and the debt and the back office which are in the RBI. The middle office, the debt management office, is and has always been the Ministry of Finance. What is true is that the capacity was not that good. I don't know if it's improved that, quite frankly, since I've been also Secretary of Economic Affairs, so I know the capacity. Okay, but the point is that it is the only the government, so that every issuance of a government Indian GSEC suggestion comes from the Reserve Bank, or a suggestion goes from the government to the Reserve Bank, then it has to be approved by the finance minister each and every time. The Reserve Bank cannot issue government debt unless authorized by the Ministry of Finance. So cannot to say that the RBI manages it. Yes, of course, they are the instrument. Second, it is also true that because of the expertise available in the RBI, there's much more knowledge about these operations in the RBI, so the government is relied on them a lot. In the government, the personnel keep changing, deputy secretaries, directors, joint secretaries, etc. So this is a real issue which has been argued again and again by the same people since the mid-2000s, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Now, what are the arrangements in the US, as an example? The US Treasury has a debt management office. which is indeed the, uh, uh, the middle office. They take all the decisions. But all the market work and issues, etc., is done by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, just like the RBI. I'm not sure who keeps all the accounts. I think it must be the FRB. Anyway, I'm not sure. But all I'm saying is not very different from elsewhere. I don't know where this thought has come, keeps coming again and again and again in different forms. Want to comment on the repo rate, which is just a reality. I've not understood why it doesn't say it in the act, but the government issued instruction that MPC can only act with the repo rate, right?
Yeah, the act says only repo rate.
The act doesn't say it.
No.
I looked at the act. Act doesn't say it. It's the government.
It's a policy rate.
Yes, this is policy rate, but the act doesn't say repo rate. But the government instruction to MPC says repo rate. So that's correct. That is, but I don't understand why that should be the case, because it stands to reason that when you do repo, when there's a shortage of liquidity, and the Reserve Bank injects liquidity into the market to the banks, and that's the rate at which the banks have to pay interest on what the RBI gives overnight. When there's excess liquidity, the banks have to park through reverse repo. So there's this corridor, it could be a little more complicated now, but my simple understanding, I may be wrong, I don't understand why the government did this and why the RBI accepted it. The MPC must do both repo and reverse repo depending on the circumstance, but I don't understand. There must be some reasons, which you may tell us if you know.
The notification.
Notification says that, yes. Yeah, notification says that, absolutely. Then finally, just on data. Your paper, plus every paper that I have seen, my colleagues, on the performance of inflation targeting. Compare the inflation outcomes after inflation targeting came in with those from either 2010 or 2012 until inflation targeting came in. Okay. Now the fact is that 1995-96 to around 2007-8, around, the average was about 5.8, depending on which measure you take, because we didn't have a unified CPI at that time. We had a CPI for industrial workers, we had a WPI, etc. The average since 2013-14 to now is about 5.5, and CPI IW is 5.8, not different. From 15 years, 14 years, I've not seen any paper evaluating inflation targeting, which gives that information. Yes, there was a little more volatility in that period than there has been. So what I'm saying is that there's an expression of faith, religion, and then you say, yes, we succeeded, but you give selective information. The fact of the matter is that 2009 to 13, there was huge fiscal expansion after the Lehman crisis, which in my view was wrong, because I've always said North Atlantic financial crisis, because we did not have such a crisis, but we had huge fiscal expansion. We also had huge monetary expansion. So you got the inflation. And the comeuppance came in 2013 with the taper tantrum. So you're comparing the post-inflation targeting period with a completely atypical period. Now, you can argue, of course, that look, that happened because you didn't have a proper target. That's a good argument. If you had a good framework, maybe that wouldn't have happened. But at the same time, 2008 to 2013, inflation was about 10%, around 10% or so. And so that, I think, laid the groundwork for people wanting the inflation targeting framework. But all I'm saying is that you cannot use the inflation outcomes after the inflation targeting framework compared to the previous 4 or 5 years. Another thing that happened in that period, talking about floating exchanges, is after around 2008, 2009, the RBI stopped intervening in the forex market until about 2012 or 13, something like that. What happened? The real exchanges really appreciated. As a consequence, we had the highest current account deficit ever, just under 5%, 4.8% in 2012-13. So that itself should tell researchers like you that you cannot say, don't intervene in forex market. There's a recipe for disaster which we had. I was then in the IMF as an executive director, and we came very close to possibly needing a fund bailout, but we didn't, luckily. So I'm saying that these are all evidence, these are facts. Now, I didn't have time to look back at some of the work I'd done earlier, but my recollection is that on the trilemma, that the data on the volatility of rupee dollar has been quite reasonable, except the last 2 years. Even before, I agree with you fully that last 2 years doesn't make sense what they've been doing. It doesn't make sense to me. The So on debt management, I've already talked about it. One other practical issue there is that it has to be either done by the RBI as an explicit agency of the government, as it is under law, or it has to be a government agency. It cannot be independent. Okay. If it's a government agency, where will the expertise come from? The advantage, these are totally practical matters. The advantage of the RBI is that you have a whole host of people in different departments, and at any given time you can have a certain number, required number, who have huge amount of knowledge of the markets and so on, who can be there. That's a practical issue. Second is, if the government has an agency, what you might call a attached office or subsidiary office, something, there is a much more of a problem of conflict of interest, because a good part of the financial sector is still owned by the government. That is the public sector banks, public sector insurance companies, life insurance company, etc., etc. So if the government has an agency not in the RBI, there's a much greater degree of conflict of interest, which is why it's not a good idea, to my mind, to have it on government. You'll have some joint secretary in charge, okay? And he will just listen, he or she will be there for 2, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Just listen to what the bosses are saying. There'll absolutely no independence. In the RBI, it's one of the best things the British did was to keep it in Bombay. So on the arm's length, and despite all the efficient communications now, it's really helpful to be there, not here. And also, I want to mention the departures from the IT framework, which everyone has done, not just RBI. After all, during and after the North Atlantic financial crisis, all central banks departed from the IT framework. But no one said so. All the actions were to do with preserving financial stability, not inflation. Luckily, during most of that period, inflation was low. That I think was due to other reasons, real economy reasons. They did QE, right? I mean, that's not that the MPC to here can't do QE. They had to do QE, do something very different than policy interest rate changes, which of course they also worked on. They bailed out a lot of financial institutions in different ways. Okay, there's nothing with inflation targeting. They took the interest rate to 0. That helped the huge increase in treasury borrowing, right? So everyone did it. The US did it, UK did it, Europe did it. So what is the nonsense about inflation targeting? It's just something to talk about. Yes, it does focus our mind that, look, there's no question that the central banks have to focus on price stability and financial stability, which unfortunately not only in the new act, plus growth. And which means that you have to have multiple indices. But that's what you look at in a 3-day meeting. Similarly, for example, fixed exchange rate. The Swiss National Bank fixed the exchange rate between the Swiss franc and the euro for a long time. Again, that was their way of managing inflation. But no one, the IMF will never criticize them. They'll criticize us if we do that. We have to think on our own, not these characters up there, right? Even though I've been among those characters. Okay. Similarly, if you think about inflation targeting, the advanced economies, as your data showed, were very slow to respond to the high inflation during COVID. My interpretation of that is because they believe too much in inflation targeting and the impact on anchoring of inflation. Because inflation had been 2% or whatever for ages, so they could not believe that a huge fiscal expansion plus a huge monetary expansion would result in inflation. Because of their belief that inflation was anchored, because of inflation targeting. That's why there was, until it really happened. Again, that also showed they were not looking 18, 24 months ahead. Right? So, these are all the issues that arise. So all central banks use multiple indicators. They will not say that. Also, composition of the MPC. We have come to, our MPC has 3 external members. Now, in the 3 major central banks, Bank of England, the external MPC members who are appointed become full-time in the Bank of England. So they can have no conflict of interest. They have to leave everything else if they accept that appointment. In the US Federal Reserve, the FOMC, which is their MPC, consists only of officials. That is, Federal Reserve Bank governors plus the district governors. There's no outsider. ECB also is all the governors of the member central banks. So it's not the case that the MPC is, in that sense, independent, which we have taken. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's a good thing. But again, you need to think of all these things rather than just taking it for granted. So, my conclusion is, A, the central banks, no question that they are the guardians of keeping low and stable inflation, but also financial stability, and also not so much aiming for growth, but facilitating growth through the other activities, through liquidity management, banking regulation, etc., etc. So I'll conclude by saying the IT framework is essentially the emperor with no clothes. That's my view. But I'm a minority of one, probably in the world, among economists. Now, I'm sorry, Ms. Rani, that I didn't have the time to look at a paper, but from the presentation you gave, very interesting actually, that one, in talking about this, you said nothing about monetary policy, right? It is very interesting how you have documented the impact of supply disruptions on inflation. And the question is that with all that information analysis, how should the Reserve Bank, any central bank, on how to address such supply disruptions with the kind of inflation outcomes that you have documented both for the world as well as for us? I think it's a very interesting question, which goes back to basically a lot of stuff that I've been saying. Also said there was no impact of the GSCPI on inflation. Again, it's interesting to go through more into it because you've done an excellent work. Also the impact of the increased global food inflation and of course the domestic food inflation. Again, the question is, how does the central bank deal with that? Okay, so one answer to that is that we have to, I do believe that food inflation has to be part of the CPI, and we have to look at the CPI headline CPI, because food inflation does transmit itself into core and generalized inflation. So you've got to look at it. Also, you need to look at the impact on inflation expectations of food inflation, because that is something that affects, in our countries, the majority of the people. I think these are the very interesting things that you have found on this, which I think can be included in thinking about how does monetary policy.
So,
Yeah.
it's all there.
Yeah, okay.
Focused on the role of supply disruption, but so the impact of monetary policy comes in the literature of monetary policy transmission.
Yeah.
So, and we have seen there is a pretty transmission happens, but with a lag, as you have already
Yeah.
said, and it happens between after 3 to 4 quarters in India. So that's there. So, but I presumed here that's a known knowledge. So that's why.
See, other thing I would say is that at least what have we been doing in India, right or wrong?
Uh-huh.
That government acts. Prices of onions goes up, they do something in the supply.
No, sir, actually, the inflation targeting framework is actually not that. It's not that now there is inflation increasing, so we are going to act. That is actually targeting the medium to long-term inflation,
And-
which means what could be the kind of a, they have to have some perception about what could be the price pressure, inflation pressure coming.
You're absolutely right.
I-
But
yeah.
what does actually happen in terms of when they take actions and what's happened to the current headline inflation?
No,
That's what we have documented. Right? So, but the other thing I was going to say is that one of the things that we in India have always been doing, right, is that we act on, taking the food side. There's the whole MSP. There's a whole supply management framework. Again, you can have
yeah.
different views on it.
So monetary policy cannot play any role in controlling the supply side shocks itself. It may have some impact on the impact of coming from there, but not the shocks itself, because monetary policy works through the aggregate demand channel.
Yeah,
That's-
exactly. Absolutely. No, all I'm saying is that when we are wanting that as a system,
Yeah.
right? If you want to control, manage inflation at low and stable level, then government has almost as much as a role, particularly in our kind of country. As the central bank, in some cases, it may be doing something wrong. Okay? In terms of huge food subsidies we gave, all kinds of stuff, right? In the sudden sort of control on exports, it was onion prices one or something. So we do all these things. I'm not saying they're correct, but what I'm saying is that there's a lot of action that takes place in that realm, okay, which comes into inflation measures. Then the central bank has to respond in terms of their judgment on how that transmits itself into generalized inflation. But if this is a large proportion of inflation, which it is, then it has implications what you actually do and how independent you should be. And as Deputy Governor RBI, I was obviously asserting very strongly that I should be independent. Okay? But my intellectual view is slightly different. Not very different, but slightly different. That is, central banks, they've always done that. After all, that's what the central banks, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the ECB, they all worked with their governments during the crisis.
Yeah,
period.
during the crisis.
You know, for example, we never had YV Reddy appearing with Mr. Chidambaram on a presentation when the Lehman crisis took place. But the US Treasury Secretary, the President of Federal Reserve New York, and the Fed Chair were constantly appearing together.
Yeah.
Because crisis they had to manage and talk to each other. That's what I'm saying. And again, I don't have a sort of a strong view of it, but
think there is
understanding of what really happens.
Yeah, so you were talking about the history of inflation targeting. So that's exactly what has happened. And actually, it was during the 1970s when there was oil price shock, and also the Bretton Woods system was broken. So
Right.
US world didn't have any anchor. There's something to anchor
right.
the inflation. So it was actually, it is not that directly the world thought about the inflation targeting. There's many phases like
There's
this
a process.
tried to target money supply, but again that didn't work because money demand is volatile, and again there is there. So I think the inflation targeting framework is not so in the it follows a sort of a rule sort of a thing. So there is one component which is the expectation about the inflation. So I think by the Monetary Policy Committee, by telling whether to change the interest rate or not, or the stance or not, it gives a signal to the market to
That's always done.
form the,
That is done in every monetary policy statement. We
Yeah.
gave a view of the expected inflation, I think over a year, if I remember correctly, and what our stance would be. There's nothing new there. We used to do it all the time.
but it is, if it is not that you say that, okay, we are going to stabilize the inflation for medium to long term or up into this band or something, what happens is like there is a seminal paper by Kidland and Prescott about the Kidland and Prescott, yeah, the time inconsistency problem of central banks. So even if, so if it is like now inflation is rising and you now respond to it. So first of all, there is a lag. So in all earlier our monetary policy, if you look at the how the transmission happened. So it used to be, there always used to be a lag with this. So now if you want to reduce the lag, is the inflation targeting tries to use the expectation channel to reduce the lag of transmission.
I agree, that's the theory.
Yeah.
Now, in the data you gave of the inflation expectations, also look at it. There's no impact.
Yeah, that I have also.
You say there's an impact.
There's no,
In
there's
your
no
paper.
impact.
The data you give shows there's no impact.
There's a.
So I,
All right, go ahead. I'm sorry to have been myself.
I just want to just respond to some of the comments. One on the rationale for inflation targeting. I think it came, if we look at back early 2000s, there the rationale for inflation targeting came from the RBI itself. If you look at the earlier technical advisory committee reports, early 2000, those reports were the first advocates for the separation, first for having an explicit inflation mandate and for separation of monetary and debt.
That was in one annual report, if I remember correctly. I think
One annual report, plus there are
think
two
it-
more reports cited in the paper.
2000.
Yeah, no, that's
And-
there.
Yes.
Yeah.
One annual report.
Yeah,
And that was reversed very quickly. Yes. People have often said this, it was in one annual report. I think in 2000.
one annual report, and then there's another technical report also. I can share also there.
No.
There's another report also on this.
There's some technical report which says we should separate debt management. That's maybe the paragraph.
Separation of monetary and debt management is there.
It was that late 90s, no? Yeah. But
And
the
then
point-
since then,
see, the point is, yes, that was correct.
Yeah.
But it wasn't done, no.
Sorry?
It wasn't done.
It wasn't done because then, we had this sustained period of long inflation, and then it wasn't done at that time. Since then, there have been multiple committee reports arguing for having an explicit inflation.
All non-RBI, by the same people.
RBI
Again and
governor,
again and again.
two RBI
That
governors.
is later, after 2010.
Yes, but they all advocated for having an
That's
explicit
correct, that's correct.
inflation
After
target.
that,
It's
because
not,
inflation got let loose after 2009.
yeah.
But as I said, none of these papers give the information that from 1995 to 2008, average inflation wasn't very different from in the inflation targeting framework. So all I'm saying is, okay, that you have to look at facts. And then I have to say, look, why did that work? And that was during a period when global inflation was higher. Again, your data showed that global inflation after inflation targeting framework was about 2% in 2019. So it was easy. Nothing to do with what you were doing. All I'm saying is that I may have a closed mind, but I'm old enough to have a closed mind. But you're too young to have a closed mind.
I'm not sure. I've read it from monetary approach, that's as Rudani, from monetary targeting, then exchange rate targeting, and then there were problems with exchange rate targeting because RBI ran short of market stabilization bonds, there were quasi-fiscal costs, so there were alternatives.
Anyway, again, even during the market stabilization period, there was no exchange rate target. I can say that personally because I was in charge of the exchange rate from 2002 to 9. Yes, we did have a view in terms of volatility. There was one period in which for a few months we stopped intervening. That was because there was some misunderstanding with the finance minister, Mr. Chidangaram, and he said, we won't approve MSP. So, all right, then we won't intervene. As soon as he saw the exchange rate appreciating, he said, oh, sorry, I didn't say that. Okay? And the MSBs came back. So, in fact, the market stabilization process is appreciated around the world as an incredible innovation. Also, cooperation between the government and the center.
But ultimately, it was discontinued. It was
Sorry?
used. It wasn't.
Well, there is no need later on.
It was
Because
used for some
the
period, but then
flows,
it was.
you look at the flows in terms of GDP, there was no choice.
Yeah.
Because prior to the MSPs, what was the Reserve Bank doing? It had, after the Pact of 95-96, when the Reserve Bank could no longer intervene in the GST market, the government had a whole stock of ad hoc securities. Again, in cooperation with the government and the RBI, they were turned into dated securities. So the RBI had a huge stock of those. So up to the invention of the MSP, the RBI had enough stock to keep using them to sterilize. You're right, when that stock came down, then we had to do something. What we did, and the government miraculously agreed because it is absolutely unusual for the government to authorize the central bank to issue government securities on which they are responsible for paying the interest. But it was terrific cooperation. That's why we were saved from 2003, 2008, 9 or something. Also, when the crisis hit, right? Because we had the stock of MSPs, we could reverse them to increase liquidity. So all I'm saying is that I'm not saying we did the best. What I'm saying is that in central banking, through its history, there are things happen with times. Views change, theories change, central banks invent things, they go back, you know. The objective, of course, financial stability, low inflation, growth. That remains the same.
So it's in the process of this evolution only that inflation targeting also came. And earlier also, prices inflation was looked at, but what changed with this was that earlier we had multiple indicators. Sometimes we're looking at CPI, WPI phone, and because the basket is different, they could give different pictures. So with inflation targeting, it was known that now the target is headline CPI. Of course, the MPC is looking at other indicators also, looking at WPI also, but there is more transparency that CPI headline is the target. It's not that core is not being looked at. So it gives a greater measure of improvement in the effectiveness and functioning of the monetary policy committee. That is one. The other is on the debt management also. The early advocate came from the RBI itself, and they have
As I
been,
said, that is incorrect. It was written in one annual report, maybe one committee.
yeah, one committee report, but it is coming from
then it
the
was
Reserve
not
Bank.
done by the RBI itself. Why? Because it was wrong. Realization came, it was wrong. What I'm saying is, if the RBI had wanted that, then they would have argued, do it.
But they have been.
By the way, I asked Dr. Jalan, who was the governor at that time, because I've had a few, a very strong view of this. She says, it somehow escaped my notice. I would not have agreed to that annual report. Okay, now I can't prove that. And yes, I also had an argument with Dr. Reddy. I had to convince him, and he agreed with all the logic. The point is, it was not done. So to say the RBI itself had this view is not correct as a general view.
The other part on the independence of debt management, we'll change the language. The point here is independent from monetary management, not having an independent debt agency as such.
It is independent monetary management.
Sorry?
It is independent monetary management because the MPC has nothing to do with
The
that.
instruments that are used for debt management are similar to the instruments that are used for
That's
monetary
everywhere. But
management.
what I'm saying is the MPC.
Wherever the debt manager is different, wherever the debt manager is not central bank, the instruments are not the same.
Right.
We have done a survey of countries where the institutions are different. There are many countries where the debt management is separate from central bank, or even within central bank, it's completely separate from monetary. Now here there are certain instances where open market operations are being used for debt management as well as for monetary management. There are these instances, and there are these very explicit instances, so it confuses the participants.
But you find that in the Federal Reserve as well during times of crisis, right? So what I'm saying is that earlier, when the RBI was able to intervene in the GSEC market, that it was totally mixed. But it wasn't really fixed. All interest rates were fixed. So RBI wasn't doing any monetary policy. All right. However, as the FRBM took place, RBI responded. And now with the MPC cannot fiddle with the repo rate. It has nothing to influence whatsoever. MPC. It's totally separated. Yes, of course, the governor is the same. But then his finance minister would be the same. So, all I'm saying is this is not an issue which some people have been harping on for 15 years, 18 years. Again and again and again.
And last point on the impossible trinity, you are right, it's not the corners, but for the last 2 years, we are seeing that there have been excessive intervention. And that has a problem for the reserve money, and that has problem for inflation management as such. And therefore, there has to be some balance. Management is fine, but now even our IMF changed its definition, de jure AREAR classification for from managed flow to pegged. Because for the last 2 years, it has been doing that.
So as I said, I 100% agree with you. That's what the last 2 years is.
Yeah, so we are also,
So you have to look at the last 30 years.
That's true. We are just giving suggestions on how to.
That's okay, but you can't say RBI has, as general policy, had a pegged exchange rate. Last 2 years,
Modify the
yes.
language to say that.
Last 2
recently,
years, yes.
Yeah,
But
say
you can't say that the Reserve Bank has a pegged exchange rate for a long period of time. Because it hasn't.
we are
Last
giving.
2 years, 100% agree with you. I think it's wrong.
So just one clarification I want to make, that when you are saying that credibility of RBI is not, it doesn't mean the credibility in terms of corruption, it means the credibility in terms of price management. So that's in that context that
Credibility has gone up. Why? Inflation expectations completely different from inflation. Inflation has come down. Inflation expectations also is the same, 10%. It wasn't 10% in the 2000s. I started the household expectations survey. A lot of opposition from internally. Okay. So, on what basis do you say that? Some market participants, yes. Those fellows talk to each other all the time in Bombay. That's all. They're only relevant to Bombay. But your household expectations are telling you. Who cares about what the RBI is saying about inflation in our country? But they care about inflation, and the expectations remain rock solid around 10%. You have that data. So how can you say there's been effects improved? What I'm saying, you've got to base your arguments not on this is what inflation targeting is supposed to do. Because all the high priests have been pushing down our throats, including the IMF, for the last 20 years. What's the reality? As I say, I'm a minority of one. So you don't have to listen to me.
Interesting discussion. Lot of heat in the room, I'd say. I guess the dramatic policy positions are quite clearly provocative of a debate. I don't think we have enough time for all the debate we'd like to have. But if there are other people who have questions or comments.
I want to comment from Vijay, since you're a member of the TAC. Before.
Asking me?
Yeah.
This conversation, I think I would say.
He's a member of the TAC.
Yeah, previous one.
Yeah.
We were also there.
Yeah. It was interesting. I don't know what you thought and how it was done.
Well, I'm very reluctant getting an argument about this. However, I think to judge the effectiveness or otherwise of monetary policy committee, of monetary targeting in terms of just the MPC, I think probably not appropriate because there are 2 or 3 independent members, as you said, and they're sort of part-time. But it's really You should take the whole of RBI and everything that it does in this context and look at whether it is being effective in targeting moderating inflation or not. I mean, that I think that would be a fair framework to look at it. After that, whether it's been effective or not should be based on the facts. That would be my position. But I would very much like to know what you think about it. You were also there, but you will also not talk because he is present here. Huh? The old culture of RBI, ki boss hai, to hum nahi. Ajay, then please tell us what you think.
Before MPC, there was a TAC. Of course, TAC didn't have any statutory,
No,
backing, whereas MPC has. No, 2-3 things which I want to mention. Of course, when we talk about the performance of IT framework, I think it's important to look back data even before 2000, because the new series came in 2011 onwards, and we can work out inflation rate only from 2012, if I remember correctly, April 2012. So it's important to go back and see how the inflation was even before that, because even in one of the op-eds which I wrote, I took those data because it was not, we had WPA, we were not targeting any inflation, but we were using WPA as a measure of inflation then. And then we didn't have any comprehensive CPI measure. Either they were, that urban non-manual employees, industrial workers and all that. So it was very difficult to, take any measure and then compare it before that. But I think it's an important point, and we should do that to compare inflation not only with much longer period, because otherwise it becomes little unbiased, biased. Yeah, and that's number one. Number two, although two major changes which inflation targeting framework has brought in, one, of course, there is a numerical target now. That's a major change. And the second is there is a committee which has external member. Other than that, everything else remains the same, if you ask me. There's no much difference between how we were framing policy earlier and how policy is being framed now. I know we, even under the earlier framework, we were monitoring all sorts of data. Even now that's being done. So the two fundamental differences which are there, which have come after the new framework has come, is numerical target is there. And with the numerical target, I would say that inflation has taken a precedence over growth. It doesn't mean the growth is sacrificed. We call it flexible inflation targeting framework.
Right.
And we have a band of 4% plus minus 2%.
So Pami was here in the morning and we were talking about
it. So it's basically that it doesn't mean that inflation targeting doesn't mean that we ignore growth. Absolutely not. Growth is equally important, but the key focus becomes on, if you find that you are not able to achieve the target, then you will not care that much about growth. That's the only difference it makes. Otherwise, for all practical purposes, monetary policy is no different from what was being done earlier.
That's what target. One thing is, because it's got a target, and because you now you have this thing of, if it is deviating from that for whatever so many quarters, then the governor has to come and explain, etc. So now it's helped focus the mind a little more in a more precise way. Doing basically is the same instruments. You don't have any new instruments, and it's not just the interest rate. I mean, the whole range of instruments. It's a more focused way of trying to get to some particular monetary targets, which you were doing earlier also, but it was more flexible in the sense you didn't have a particular inflation rate to get at. So you didn't have to explain anything.
In every statement, we said this is what we expect. We didn't say it as a target, but we said, I think for 12 months, something like that, I've forgotten now.
That this is what you're aiming at.
Yes, that's what he said. It wasn't a target. You're not targeting. So the other thing, actually, I was thinking, Sudipto.
Different in a projection, a target. I mean, your projection thing is what like to happen, but a target is that you want to get there.
No, target was not there. That's what I'm saying.
Target. That's what we wanted to do. We didn't say it's a target.
Yeah.
So just one other, actually, I was reflecting that even this and some other time I was reflecting on period 90s, 1980s and 90s. Okay, it's very interesting to me what the RBI was effectively doing when it was much less independent. Okay, it really controlled liquidity through the very high CRR and the very high SLR. And so all through that period, I don't remember the ups and downs, but all through that period, they had this huge financial depression, which kept Indian inflation lower than most other emerging markets. Very interesting that it was not seen, I mean, I've not seen anyone talk about this, but it's certainly the case that there was huge financial depression, which kept liquidity down in the economy. The banks couldn't lend because everything was taken by the RBI or the government between CRR and SLR.
So coming to this issue of that exchange rate and monetary management, if you look at the data for, I think, September 2018, when the US Fed started raising it, there was no clamor for that RBI should have unscheduled meeting and then raise rate. If you see that meeting, the Reserve Bank didn't raise the rate because there was some problem in the foreign exchange market. So it's all independent. No, instruments could be the same. Like if you use interest rate to defend the exchange rate, then you can say that the RBI is using monetary policy to defend the exchange rate. In some countries, they have done that. Many countries have done that. What is called monetary defense of the exchange rate. But the point is, we never used a monetary tool to intervene to defend the exchange rate. And whatever exchange rate is there, it's market determined, but we do, in order to maintain orderly condition, we do intervene occasionally, either we buy or sell. So, but that is a separate, instrument which is used. It's not the same instrument which is used. And the same is the case with monetary management and debt management. Now, government securities that comes into existence because of government securities. Now, the central bank does operation in government securities. But when we conduct open market operations, we conduct open market operations to add or take out durable liquidity from the system in order to ensure that the interest rate, which is a weighted average call rate, remains aligned to the operating time. If you don't do that, normally we do through short-term operations. But when there is a shortage of durable liquidity, then we have to inject durable liquidity. In the process, it's possible that the yield is impacted, but that's not our objective. So, but if it comes down, it's fine. There's no problem. It's you can say it's a subsidiary objective. Objective you achieve, but you are not basically trying to reduce yield on government security. You're basically trying to manage liquidity. In the process, if the yield comes down, that's okay. Yeah.
Weighted average call rate was closer to the repo rate, but the 10-year G-Sec was higher. And then the open market operation. Normally, as you said, open market operation brought short-term DRR, DRR, and market to modulate and align call rate with the repo rate. But if there are some situations where call rate is closer to the repo rate, but the 10-year G-Sec is higher.
But still, it is possible. You may be lining the short-term weighted average call rate with your repo rate, but if you feel there is a shortage of durable liquidity, you have to inject. And as the economy expands, you need to inject durable liquidity into the system. So just because we are conducting open market operation doesn't mean that we are trying to manage the yield. That's not. People have misconception, but I don't think that's the case.
There's some third point you wanted to make. You said there are 3 points.
Third point. Back then, many countries were targeting property targets, and the money demand function had
Money supply.
and become unstable. But the separation of the independence of the central bank of the government. They didn't do it because of money demand function had become unstable, and for that, to that. And it's independence of the central bank. That's why I really share with you that 2% target which came. It was not based on any scientific Search.
So there, yeah.
So, but then,
Huh?
so I think they got the idea from Central Bank of Germany, because after the Second World War, when the British Bank was set, their mandate was that price stability is the main mandate, and it was independent from it was an independent central bank. So that's.
In terms of. Yeah. See what happens if we are when we had monetary targeting approach. So that was okay, but when money demand function became stable, we started following multiple indicator approach.
Right.
That was a very fuzzy approach, if you ask me. And what are the other frameworks you have? You have nominal inflation target, nominal GDP targeting framework, which no country has done. You have price level targeting, about which some people are talking about, that has not been done. So my only issue is that we didn't have really any other proper framework which you could adopt, and this was the only framework which had been able to achieve some credibility by then. We were not the first one to do. Yeah, we were almost the last. We adopted in 2015, 16. So, no, many years after other central banks had done. So it's not that we simply jumped into this framework.
Extensive
Yeah.
literature across.
So I differ with him on this, that in the absence of inflation targeting framework, I didn't know really what other framework you could have adopted,
You're saying
and multiple indicator approach was a bit fuzzy, I would say.
having something as a goal helps you focus the mind and coordinate all your, whether you get there or not. But I wanted to ask you all have looked at central bank performance more than we have. This 2% thing, it may be arbitrary. But the point is that all these central banks, it appears to me, looking from the outside, are actually quite effective in managing inflation, bringing it down. I mean, look at the.
That's basically expectations of that. That sounds
You anchors your mind.
when the doctor of the 7%, 7.5% supposed to.
But I think that is, in fact, that is at the core of the thinking. It's this new Keynesian framework that expectations play a key role. So through signal, this, that, you get the market to believe that this is what it will be, and therefore you get there. Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Hmm. Market what? Not very big. Mhm.
So the impact. So, let's say if you're 90% of GDP or 10%, what does it mean for corporate investments? So you want to look at the markets are accepted. It's also what those countries did. The market.
Kavita, we already keep on talking. There are people at the back who want to ask questions also. I think give them a chance.
Yeah. So I have this question for Radhika. So there is a literature, there's a paper by Brito and Bested. It's a 2010 paper where they look at the IT regime for the emerging market countries, and they find that adoption of IT has led to more volatility of the growth rate. So I'm just curious because I didn't see that in your paper. If you could just show what happened to output volatility in India, pre and post IT adoption. That would be interesting because we have this literature. So you can pit it against it, and we'd like to see what goes on there. So that is one thing. The other thing was for your paper, Rudrani's paper. And it's true that you're looking at the supply disruption and how it affects inflation. But again, there's a whole body of literature which talks about how deficit has a role to play in affecting inflation, because prices absorb that deficit shock as well. So since you're doing a TVP VAR, so if you could just have maybe a deficit parameter and then show a variance decomposition showing how that shock sort of explains what happens to inflation. I mean, just in terms of the supply shock, in addition to whether, these fiscal stimuli affecting the price level, that would be interesting because
I think during that, what Sir was saying, during 2009.
yes, 2009, and of course in the US, there was a huge fiscal stimulus, but of course inflation didn't go up that much.
I think that is the time when we see that inflation in India was demand-driven.
Yes.
It's always supply shocks.
To some extent, yeah. So therefore, there's always this tussle between whether it's supply driven or so. If you could just bring in that deficit aspect of it and show a variance decomposition, that would help. Thank you.
Anybody else has questions, comments? Anybody from online joining us for the present? Anybody from our online audience who would like?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah. You are.
Yes, ma'am. Harun. Yes, ma'am. Harun, this side, I have 3 points to raise regarding the presentation. One is about the paper argues that inflation targeting was able to do well in the Indian context. But if we look at the graph that was in the presentation about the inflation during inflation targeting approach, what we have witnessed whenever CPI inflation was high, during that period, food inflation and oil inflation or fuel inflation, it was also high. One thing, that means RBI is not able to control inflation whenever food inflation or oil inflation is high. Second thing, if we go through the slide, it was talking about inflation expectations. It's again, there's a mismatch between expectations and actual inflation. Not only the mismatch, but actual inflation is more volatile as compared to inflation expectations. And I would like to raise a question about the transparency of inflation targeting approach. It is RBI has missed this target twice, one in 2020 and one in 2022. And during these two periods, food inflation was high. Now the question is about transparency. Initially, they didn't submit the report to the RBI to the government of India by claiming that we could not get the data during COVID. So, in other words, they were actually questioning their own data. Second, during the second instance, they submitted the report to the government of India, but government of India did not make it public. So this raises serious question on the transparency of the inflation targeting approach. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Either if you like to take the question. Is it working?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
So on the report, the law is actually silent on whether the report needs to be made public or not. Therefore, it wasn't made public. It was only the RBI Act says that the MPC has to draft a report and submit it to the government. Of course, there are other examples like the Bank of England where the report is made public, but in India the report was not made public. But we do understand the reasons why at that time inflation deviated from target. There were a host of external shocks that resulted in the deviation of target from the 6%, from 2 to 6%. So we do know the thing. But yes, if there is another review, there could be a case for making the report public. But as of now, the law is silent. So, we cannot even formally expect that the report should be made public. Thank you.
There's.
And I was there actually in the Reserve Bank when there were more than 3 quarters when the inflation had exceeded even before this. But then one or 2 months data, they were not released like because of lockdown, and data couldn't be compiled. So the government had issued said that these data were not to be used. Something like that happened. So that's how. Otherwise, it would have been twice. Right. But it didn't. If you see on the paper, it's only once.
There's another question there. I think it's Nikhil Rampal. I'm trying to understand why inflation and monetary policy rates go in opposite direction when crisis occurs. Can there be an explanation on that?
So if it's a financial crisis and there is less of liquidity, the government would like to, central bank would like to keep the rate low, but inflation. So any particular crisis?
Yeah, example.
Nikhil, is there any particular crisis you have in mind while raising this question? Can you give an example? COVID.
Yes,
so
yes. During the COVID-19, the US Fed led to some overshooting because the inflation was rising, but the Fed was also decreasing the rates at the same times. And also during the 2008-9 crisis, if you look at the post-crisis period, the rates were raised, but inflation wasn't coming down either. Like there are sometimes like around the crisis, there are no curve movements,
Yeah,
but
got it.
post-crisis.
So
Yeah.
I mean, you can. I just during COVID, the preliminary objective was to support growth at that time because it was understood that inflation is transitory and is being driven by supply side shortages, and growth was the prime concern, and therefore the prime objective was to cut rates to support growth. So that is one example. Otherwise, if you see most of the cases when inflation goes up, the repo rate is raised. So at that time, the primary concern was growth. So that is why repo rate was cut during that time, and rightly so.
Okay. Any other questions online, offline? Okay. So we then come to the end of a very intense second half. The only comment I have, the only thought I have on some of the discussion is I think there are two schools of thought on whether RBI should be treated as this fountain of wisdom who knows what to do, whatever the state, and so we should just trust them and let them do whatever they know what to do. We just leave it up to them. That versus an alternative school where we would like to know what we would like to have predictability on what the RBI would like to focus on. It just maybe two different ways of looking at the world. But we can have another debate on it. So we leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Just make a very short comment on what was just said by Radhika. Right? That during the COVID, whether here or in the US, the objective was growth. So we did something. There's not an inflation target, right?
Yeah.
So what the hell does it mean? Right? All I'm saying is that, yes, this is a nice fig leaf. समझ आ गया क्या करते हैं ये लोग. Okay? But the fact is what they do is always very complex. Mm-hmm. And yes, it is true, they must explain what they do, which is what is being done. So all I'm saying is that there is no question that you need to focus on price stability, but also financial stability, and also growth when necessary. Right. That's exactly what was always being done. There's nothing different. That's what I'm saying. This is just simply सबको समझ आ गया ये price target करते हैं. Okay, and this is worldwide. It's not us. Okay, we unfortunately caught the infection. I resisted it as long as I could. Then, of course, I had to retire, and they fell.
you very much for a very interesting half day. And thank you for taking the time. I understand you were at a nice lunch and we had to drag you out of that. So
There's a
hopefully
leak.
it was a good
There's a leak. There's a leak here.
Yes, there is always a leak somewhere or the other. So, but we appreciate it. Highly appreciate it.
So I thought that Ela would be here. So, no. So, yeah, we're missing it terribly. I was challenged by Nainan. I said to Nainan that I'm going to sing and I'll be the paper by Ela and other colleagues. So I said, and I said, you're a good friend. So he said, I challenge you to say in the seminar that Nainan sends his best regards to his good friend. So now you can report that I've said it, but Ela is not here.